The crowd laughed the day she stepped out of the carriage. They laughed as she entered the church. They whispered that Rowan Mercer had dug his own grave, that he had lost not only his farm, but his dignity. But while the whole town of Black Ridge was busy judging what they saw, Clara Ashford was observing things nobody else noticed, things that could change everything. This is the story of the woman the frontier despised and then had to bow down to. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. The wagon rolled into Black Ridge on a Thursday morning in late October, 1891, trailing a thin line of red dust behind it that the wind scattered almost immediately. The sky was the pale, washed-out blue of early autumn, the kind of sky that looked pretty enough from a distance, but offered no warmth to anyone standing beneath it. A few men loitering outside Haskell's general store shielded their eyes and watched the wagon slow near the church. Word had already spread. Rowan Mercer's mail-order bride had arrived. It hadn't taken long for word to spread. It never did in Black Ridge. Rowan stood at the church steps in his good shirt, which was visibly too tight across the shoulders, and had a faint ring at the collar where he'd scrubbed it too hard the night before. He was 34 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spent most of their lives outdoors became weathered. Not distinguished exactly, but solid-looking, like a fence post that had been through a few hard winters. He wasn't a handsome man, but he wasn't a weak one either, and the people of Black Ridge had respected him for that, at least until his father died 18 months ago and left him with debts nobody had seen coming. He watched the wagon pull up and felt his jaw tighten. He didn't know what he'd expected. The agency in Cheyenne had sent a photograph, but it was the kind of photograph that told you almost nothing. A woman seated in a chair, hands folded in her lap, looking directly at the camera with an expression that gave nothing away. Dark hair, serious eyes. He'd written 3 letters and received 3 letters in return, each one precise and oddly businesslike, answering his questions about the ranch without asking many questions of her own. He'd found that either reassuring or unsettling, depending on which hour of the night he thought about it. The wagon stopped. The driver climbed down and opened the side door, and Clara Ashford stepped out onto the dirt road in front of Black Ridge's only church. She was not what any of them had expected. She was tall, nearly as tall as Rowan, and solidly built in a way that the women of Black Ridge, most of whom were thin from hard work and thin diets, were not. She wore a traveling dress that was clean but not fine, a deep brown that had probably been fashionable 5 years ago, and she moved with a kind of deliberate steadiness. Not graceful exactly, but unhurried, as if she had calculated the distance from the wagon step to the ground and decided it required no particular ceremony. She had a plain face with strong cheekbones and dark eyes that moved quickly, taking in the church, the steps, the men watching from across the road, Rowan himself, before settling into an expression that revealed precisely nothing. From the side of the road, someone laughed. It was a short, ugly sound, quickly swallowed, but not quickly enough. Rowan heard it. Clara heard it too. Neither of them acknowledged it. "Mr. Mercer," she said, stopping a few feet from him. Her voice was steady. Not warm, not cold. Simply even. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Good trip?" "Long," she said. "The road from Laramie gets worse past the first creek crossing." "It does," he agreed. That was the entirety of their greeting. They went inside. Gosid. The ceremony lasted 19 minutes. Reverend Hollis performed it with the brisk efficiency of a man who had learned not to invest sentiment in practical arrangements, which was perhaps the most useful thing about him. Rowan said the words. Clara said the words. They did not look at each other during the vows so much as slightly to the left of each other, which seemed honest given the circumstances. The witnesses were Rowan's ranch hand, Deke Pruitt, who smelled of hay and stood with his hat in both hands like a man awaiting sentencing, and Margaret Hollis, the Reverend's wife, who smiled at Clara in the determined, pitying way that women smile at other women they have already decided to feel sorry for. Afterwards, standing outside in the pale October sunlight, Clara watched a cluster of women near the millinery shop across the road, talking quietly among themselves, glancing in her direction. She recognized the nature of the conversation without being able to hear a word of it. "My wagon's around back," Rowan said. "Ranch is about 6 miles north." "I'd like to see it before dark," she said. They drove north in silence for most of the first mile. The land on either side of the road was flat and brown and enormous, in the way that high plains land always was. Not empty exactly, but indifferent, as if the landscape had long ago decided that human concerns were a temporary inconvenience it could wait out. "How bad is it?" Clara asked, without looking at him. Rowan's hands tightened on the reins. "What do you mean?" "The ranch," she said. "I read your letters carefully. You said the cattle operation was reduced after your father's passing. You said the fences needed some attention. You said water access was somewhat limited." She paused. "Men who are doing fine don't write letters like that to a marriage agency." A long silence. The wagon wheels ground slowly over dried ruts in the road. "It's bad," he finally said. "How bad?" "I owe Edgar Sloan at the county bank $1,100. I've got maybe 40 head left after selling off to cover last winter's costs. The north pasture fence is down in 3 places and I haven't had the money to fix it, so those cattle drift. 2 of my hands quit in July. Deke stayed, but I'm only paying him half wages." He said it flatly, like a man reciting inventory. "My father ran good cattle once. He made some decisions at the end that didn't work out." Claire was quiet for a moment. "What kind of cattle did he run?" "Mixed stock mostly, some Texas Longhorns, a couple of what he called British breeds. Shorthorns maybe, or close to it. He got them from a rancher up near Casper who was selling out." Claire's head turned slightly toward him. "Shorthorns from the Casper area," she said. "Who was the rancher?" Rowan frowned. "Fella named Briggs. Amos Briggs. You know him?" "I know of him," she said carefully. "He imported cattle from Ontario before he came west. Good bloodlines." She paused. "Which of those animals are still alive?" "I don't know," he said. "Some of them, maybe. The ones that survived the winter." She said nothing for the rest of the ride, but when they turned up the long, rutted track toward the Red Bluff Ranch, and the main house came into view, a 2-story wood-frame structure that had once been decent and was now simply tired, its porch listing slightly on one side, its paint peeled down to bare gray wood, Rowan noticed that Clara wasn't looking at the house. She was looking at the cattle visible in the lower pasture, counting, he realized. She was counting. The ranch hands who remained, Deke Pruitt, and a young man named Cass, who was 18 and worked for meals and a cot in the bunkhouse, greeted Clara with the strained politeness of men who have been told to be polite and are trying hard. Deke was 40-something, bow-legged, with a dense gray mustache and the particular brand of skepticism that long experience produces in practical men. He shook her hand once, firmly, said "Ma'am," and then looked at Rowan with an expression that said, plainly, "I hope you know what you're doing." Cass simply stared until Deke elbowed him. Clara shook both their hands, said she hoped they'd get along, and then asked Deke where the cattle records were kept. Deke blinked. "The records? Purchase records, breeding records, any documentation on where the animals came from." Another blink. "Rowan's father kept some papers in the office." "I'd like to see them after supper," she said, "and I'd like to walk the lower pasture before the light goes." She went upstairs with her trunk. Cass carried it up, red-eared and silent, and came back down in 20 minutes wearing different clothes. Working clothes. Heavy wool skirt, thick stockings, boots that had real wear on them, a coat that had been repaired at the cuffs. Rowan watched her cross the yard toward the pasture with long, unhurried strides, and felt a complicated sensation he couldn't immediately name. He followed her because he couldn't think of what else to do. The lower pasture held 31 animals. Rowan counted them regularly because counting them was one of the only ways he could prove to himself that things hadn't gotten worse overnight. Clara walked among them with a quietness that surprised him. She moved slowly, gave the animals space, didn't rush or make sudden movements. She wasn't the kind of quiet that came from uncertainty. It was more purposeful than that. She stopped near a cluster of 6 animals near the far fence line and crouched slightly, studying them. Rowan came up beside her. "Those 6, she said without turning. "What about them?" "They're different from the others. Look at the frame, the depth of chest on the 2 cows in the back." She pointed, a short, direct gesture. "That's not Longhorn. That's not standard range cattle either. Those are, or they're close to, the animals your father bought from Briggs. Rowan studied them. He honestly couldn't see what she was seeing. They looked like cattle to him. All right, he said slowly. How old is the bull in that group? 6 years, maybe. He was one of 3 my father had. The other 2 didn't make it through the spring of '90. 6 is still good, she said, almost to herself. She stood up, walked around the group, stopped behind the 2 cows she'd pointed out. She was quiet for a long time. Mr. Mercer. Rowan. She glanced back at him. Rowan, I need to see those records tonight. Everything your father had. She paused. Don't make any decisions about the herd until I've looked at them. I wasn't planning on selling anybody, he said, slightly defensive. I know. I'm saying the opposite. She looked back at the cattle. Some of these animals may be worth more than you realize. The office was a small room off the kitchen that Rowan's father had used for keeping papers and avoiding his wife, in that order. It smelled of old tobacco and the particular dusty staleness of files that haven't been opened in a year. Clara sat at the desk with the lamp pulled close and went through every paper in the drawers while Rowan sat in the corner and watched her with the specific feeling of a man who is both grateful and humiliated by the same thing. She didn't speak for almost an hour. She read each document carefully, sometimes setting things aside, sometimes going back to something she'd already read. Her handwriting was small and precise when she made notes. She'd produced a small notebook from her coat pocket without explanation, and she filled half a page before she looked up. Your father paid $43 a head for 9 animals from Amos Briggs in March of 1887, she said. 3 bulls and 6 heifers. There's a receipt and a letter of provenance here that traces 4 of those animals to a farm in Prescott, Ontario. She held up the letter. The Prescott Shorthorns were a respected breeding line, Rowan. They were known for throwing good calves even on poor pasture. They were the kind of cattle that could survive a hard winter and still hold condition. He stared at her. My father never mentioned that. He may not have understood what he had. She set the letter down. The bull in the lower pasture. I'd need to look more closely, but I think he's out of one of those original heifers. And if he is, then at current market for documented breeding bulls, he could be worth considerably more than you've been treating him. She paused. The 2 cows near the fence, same situation. They're carrying calves, both of them. And if those calves are what I think they could be, you're saying I've been sitting on valuable animals and didn't know it, Rowan said. I'm saying it's possible, she said carefully. I need to look at the animals more closely in good light tomorrow. But yes, it's possible. They sat in the small, musty office while the lamp flickered, and Rowan tried to reorder his understanding of the past year and a half. The debt. The desperation that had led him to write letters to a marriage agency in Cheyenne in the first place. The 40 head he'd sold at desperate prices to cover the mortgage payments. And here was this woman who had been in Black Ridge for less than 8 hours, telling him that the thing he'd been looking for might have been in his own lower pasture all along. You know a lot about cattle he started. For a woman? She said, with a flatness that told him she'd heard that sentence before. I was going to say for someone raised in Laramie, he said, which wasn't entirely true but wasn't entirely a lie either. She looked at him for a moment. My uncle ran a mixed operation in Nebraska for 22 years. I kept his books and his breeding records from the time I was 12. I learned what I learned. She closed the notebook. People assume a lot of things about what I know and don't know based on what they see when they look at me. She said it without bitterness, simply as a statement of fact. I've stopped trying to change that. I just let the work speak. Rowan said nothing. There wasn't much to say to that. Word traveled through Black Ridge by the next morning that Rowan Mercer's new wife had already been seen walking the pastures before sunrise. The report came from a farmhand at the neighboring Dupree property who'd spotted a figure with a lamp moving along the fence line in the pre-dawn dark and thought, initially, that someone was stealing cattle. At Haskell's General Store, this information was received with the tone it deserved. She's going to drive that ranch straight into the ground, said Tom Pryor, who ran the feed store and had strong opinions about everything. A woman who looks like that thinking she can manage cattle, Lord help him. She's from Laramie, said someone else, as if this explained something specific. Margaret Hollis, who was buying flour and had more Christian charity than most, offered the tentative suggestion that perhaps they ought to wait and see. This was received with the patient skepticism that frontier towns reserved for people who suggested waiting and seeing when judgment could be rendered immediately. At the cattle baron's ranch 5 miles east of town, Victor Hale heard about the new Mrs. Mercer over breakfast and found it briefly amusing. Victor was 51 years old, thick-necked and prosperous, the kind of man who'd spent so many years being right about things that he'd lost the ability to seriously consider being wrong. He ran 1,200 head across land he'd accumulated over 2 decades through means that were almost entirely legal. He'd watched Rowan's operation declining with the particular satisfaction of a man waiting for a piece of land to become available. "She won't last a winter," he told his ranch manager. "Mercer took a desperate measure, and it won't pay off. It never does." He went back to his breakfast. The morning after the wedding, Clara walked the entire fence line of the Red Bluff property, all 4 miles of it, with Deke Pruitt, who followed 3 paces behind her and offered skeptical commentary. "That section there's been down since August," he said, pointing to a stretch of posts leaning at various indefensible angles. "Rowan meant to get to it, but the money wasn't there." "What's on the other side?" she asked. "Open range, Dupree grazing land north of that. So our cattle could drift onto Dupree's range, and we'd lose track of them." "Could? Yes," Deke allowed. "And have they?" A pause. "Some." She made a note. She'd been making notes all morning, on the fence, on the water, on the grass, on the condition of the cattle she passed. Deke watched her write with the expression of a man deciding whether to be impressed or annoyed and landing somewhere in the middle. "The creek," she said, when they reached the dry channel that cut across the northeast corner of the property. "This is your water source?" "Spring-fed, or it was. It's been low this year. Dries up completely in August now." She crouched at the edge of the channel and looked upstream. "This didn't used to dry up in August," she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am. Used to run good until maybe 3 years ago." "There's something blocking it upstream," she said. "Debris, maybe. Silt. It's not a drought issue. Look at the banks." She stood up. "The soil is still wet 6 inches down. The water is here. It's just not moving through the channel." Deke looked at the creek bed, then at her. "You saying it's fixable?" "I'm saying it might be," she said carefully. "I don't make claims until I've looked properly." She made another note. "Show me the north pasture next." They walked the north pasture, which was badly overgrazed. The grass cropped down to almost nothing in places, with bare patches of pale dirt where even the root system had given up. Clara moved through it slowly, crouching every so often to examine the soil, pressing her palm flat against the ground in a few places, looking at the root depth of what grass remained. "How long has the herd been on this pasture?" Deke thought about it. "Going on 2 years solid, most of them. Rowan didn't have the hands to rotate them." "Right," she said. She stood up and looked across the ruined pasture. "The grass isn't dead," she said. "It's just exhausted. If we pull the cattle off this section for 8 months, it'll come back." 8 months is a long time." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She looked at her notes. "The south pasture, that section along the ridge. How is that?" "Never been grazed much. Too far from the water." She wrote something down. "Not anymore," she said quietly. "Cat." They reached the house around noon. Clara went directly to Rowan, who was in the barn working on a piece of harness with the focused determination of a man who didn't know what else to do with himself. "I need to talk to you about the herd," she said. He set the harness down. She laid out what she'd seen with the directness of someone who had learned that softening practical information wasted time. The fence, fixable. 4 days of work if she and Deke and Cass did it together. The water, possibly fixable, required investigating the upstream channel, maybe a day's clearing work. The north pasture needed to rest, cattle had to come off it immediately. The south pasture, further from water, but the grass was good, and once the creek was cleared it would be accessible. And then the herd. "I want to look at every animal carefully over the next 2 days," she said. "I want to look at the breeding bull, and those 2 cows especially. If they are what I think they might be, then the rest of the decisions we make have to center on protecting those animals." Rowan listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that she was beginning to understand. Not passive, but the kind of listening that was actually processing, that was taking things in and arranging them against what he already knew. It wasn't a stupid man's listening, just a man who'd been moving too fast and too scared for too long to see clearly. "The herd," he said when she finished. "You're saying the herd as it is? As it is, you have 40 head of mixed quality on a ranch that can barely support 20 in its current state," she said. "Every animal you're trying to feed is pulling nutrition away from the animals that might actually carry this operation forward." She paused. "I know what I'm going to say sounds wrong. It might be wrong, but I need you to consider it. Say it." She met his eyes. "Sell most of them." The silence in the barn stretched for several seconds. A horse shifted in its stall. Outside, wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood near the fence. "Sell them," he repeated. "Keep the bull. Keep those 2 cows. Keep 4 more animals I'll identify tomorrow. And sell everything else." "Clara, that leaves me with 14 head," she said. "I know, and it sounds insane. It sounds like giving up." She kept her voice level. "But if those 6 animals are what I believe they are, then 40 head of ordinary cattle are costing you money, while those 6 animals represent an actual future. 14 animals that you can feed properly, on pasture that can recover, with water that functions, are worth more than 40 animals starving on ruined land." Rowan stared at her. "You've been here one day." "I know." "You looked at my cattle for a few hours." "I know. And you're telling me to sell most of my herd." "I'm telling you to consider it," she said. "And I'm telling you that I've been reading cattle since I was 12 years old, and I know what I'm looking at." She paused. "I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm your wife. I'm asking you to look at what I've shown you and make the decision yourself." He was quiet for a long time. She watched him work through it, watched the fear and the resistance and the reluctant logic move across his face. "If those animals aren't what you think," he said finally, "if this doesn't work, then we're in worse shape than we are now," she said honestly. "Yes, that's the risk." Deke Pruitt's opinion of the plan was delivered in the bunkhouse to Cass that evening, in tones quiet enough that he hoped Clara couldn't hear him through the kitchen wall. "She's either the smartest person who's walked onto this property in 10 years, he said, pulling off his boot, "or she's going to finish what the drought started." Cass, who at 18 was still in the stage of deciding what he thought by listening to what other people thought, chewed this over. "She seems to know what she's talking about," he offered. "Seems," Deke repeated. He set the boot down. "Seems is a word that's preceded a lot of disasters." He lay back on the cot. "But Rowan's already looking at her different, and Rowan is not a man who changes his view easily. So," he closed his eyes. "We'll see." The next morning, Clara was in the lower pasture before the sun was fully up, moving among the cattle with careful patience. She spent nearly 3 hours examining each animal individually, looking at conformation, at muscle structure, at the condition of the coat, at the teeth, at the way animals carried themselves. She ran her hands along flanks and down legs with the calm authority of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. The cattle, for the most part, accepted her presence. Animals recognize a certain quality of attention, and Clara's was steady rather than anxious, which was more than could be said for most of the humans currently on the Red Bluff property. The bull she examined longest. He was a handsome animal, not enormous, but well-built, with the deep barrel chest and short legs that marked the shorthorn influence. He was also, she confirmed by his manner, extremely tractable, which in a breeding bull was not just convenient but genuinely valuable. She came back to the house midday and sat across from Rowan at the kitchen table. "I was right," she said. "The bull and both cows are shorthorn crosses, probably 2nd or 3rd generation from the Briggs line. The calves those cows are carrying, if they go to term strong, could be the foundation of something real." She set her notes down. 2 of the steers in the mixed group have enough frame to suggest they carry some of the same blood. I'd keep those as well. That gives us 14 animals total. Rowan looked at the notes. Then he looked at her. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right?" "We'll do it your way." She studied him for a moment, as if checking whether he meant it. He looked back at her steadily. "The day after tomorrow," he said. "I'll take the others to the stockyard at Crane's Crossing. Whatever they bring, it'll clear some of the debt. She nodded. Her face gave very little away, but she exhaled slowly through her nose in a way that told him she'd been more anxious about his answer than she'd let on. He filed that away. "The fence first," she said, pulling the notepad back toward her. "We start on the fence this afternoon." What followed were the hardest weeks Clara had spent since leaving Laramie. Not because of any single thing, but because of the cumulative weight of work that had been deferred too long. Repairs stacked on repairs, problems that had been ignored until they became crises. A ranch that needed 3 months of intensive work and had the labor supply of one woman, one veteran hand, and one teenager. The fence took 4 days, not because the work was complex, but because several of the post holes were frozen in the upper layer and had to be chipped out slowly. Clara worked the fence line alongside Deke, who stopped making skeptical comments after the second day. Not because he'd fully converted to her cause, but because the woman clearly knew how to set a fence post, and he had the useful quality of respecting competence when he saw it. The creek took longer. Claire and Cass spent 2 days working upstream from the dry channel, and found, as she had suspected, a debris dam that had gradually built up behind a fallen cottonwood over several years, redirecting the flow sideways into a marshy area that simply soaked into the ground rather than running down the channel. The clearing work was cold and wet and miserable, and when the water finally broke through and began to run down the channel properly, Cass made a sound of pure surprise that Clara found unexpectedly satisfying. "You knew it was going to do that," he said, staring at the water. "I thought it might," she said, which was the most she allowed herself. She moved the cattle to the south pasture as soon as the fence was secure and the creek was running. The 14 animals, the bull, the 2 pregnant cows, the 2 shorthorn cross steers, and 9 others she'd selected for either breeding potential or condition, were moved while the remaining herd was being driven to Crane's Crossing by Rowan. He came back from the stockyard with $260, which cleared almost a quarter of the bank debt and left him with enough to buy the fencing wire and timber Clara had written on a list before he left. He handed her the list back when he returned, checking items off. "Everything except the wire for the east section," he said. "Haskell didn't have enough in stock. He's ordering it." "How long?" "2 weeks, maybe." She filed that away. "The cattle behaved for Deke while we were gone?" "Quiet," he said. "That bull has a real easy temperament." "I know," she said. "That's one of the reasons he's worth keeping." They stood in the yard in the thin November light, both of them tired in a way that sat deep in the bones, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It was the kind of quiet that can mean different things depending on what 2 people are to each other, and Rowan and Clara were still working out what they were to each other with the same cautious practicality they applied to everything else. "You ate?" he asked. "Cass made something," she said. "There's some left." They went inside. But Clara began keeping meticulous records of every animal on the property. She bought a ledger from Haskell's, her own money, the small amount she'd brought from Laramie, and entered each animal by description, estimated age, provenance notes, and condition. She began logging what each animal ate against how it looked week to week, tracking the slow recovery that she'd hoped for and was beginning to see. The pregnant cows concerned her through November. Both were carrying well, but the older of the 2, a deep red animal she privately called Anchor, though she kept that to herself, was showing some strain, and Clara found herself checking on her early and late, often in the cold dark before Deke or Cass were out. Rowan found her there one morning in late November, her lamp making a small orange circle in the pre-dawn black of the barn. "Something wrong?" he asked. "Just watching," she said. He came and stood beside her. They looked at the cow together. "She going to be all right?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly. "I hope so. Her calf is the one I'm most interested in." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "The way you look at those animals," he said, "it's like you're working something out in your head." "I usually am," she said. "What are you working out right now?" She considered the question. "I'm trying to see what she's going to produce," she said. "I'm trying to look at her and her history and the bull, and what I know about the bloodlines and Project Forward. See what this herd could become if everything goes the way I think it might." She paused. It's guesswork, educated guesswork. But it's what breeding is. He looked at the cow. What do you see? She turned her head and looked at him instead, which seemed to surprise him slightly. Something worth protecting, she said. If we don't do anything stupid. They stood there a while longer in the lamplight, and if either of them felt the strangeness of their situation, two people standing in a cold barn in the dark, still essentially strangers, bound together by a practical decision that had seemed simple at the time. Neither of them mentioned it. The cow was fine. She ate well that morning, and when Clara checked her again at midday, she was settled and calm, and the strain that had worried her seemed to have eased. Clara wrote it down in the ledger. Then she went back to work. By December, something had shifted on the Red Bluff Ranch that was hard to name precisely. It wasn't prosperity. The debt remained. The bank remained. Edgar Sloan at the county bank had already sent one letter that winter asking for an update on the payment schedule, written in the smooth, confident language of a man who expected the answer he wanted. The cattle were still few, the pasture still recovering, the house still drafty in ways that required constant renegotiation with blankets and firewood. But the cattle that remained were visibly healthier. Even Deke noticed it. He mentioned it once, in the offhand way he mentioned things he'd decided were important but didn't want to make a production of. Those animals look different than they did in September, he said one morning, filling his coffee cup in the kitchen. Clara looked up from her ledger. Different how? Filled out, he said. The bull especially. He was looking pretty rough when you got here. He's different now. She looked back down at the ledger. Good feed and decent water, and not being crowded by 40 animals competing for the same grass, she said. It adds up. Deke drank his coffee. I've been doing this 20 years, he said. I never thought to count up what an animal was worth separate from what the whole herd was worth. Just all cattle are cattle, you know? I know, she said. Most people think that way. But they're not all the same, he said. It wasn't quite a question. No, she agreed. They're not. He set the cup down and went out to begin the morning feeding. At the door, he stopped without turning around. You done all right, he said, for somebody who's only been here 2 months. So then he went out, and Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with her ledger and the coffee that was now cold, and allowed herself, very quietly, to feel that she had not made a mistake in coming here. But the ranch wasn't saved yet. The bank debt was still real. Edgar Sloan was still waiting, and on the eastern edge of Black Ridge, Victor Hale had started asking questions, quiet questions through intermediaries, about the cattle operation at Red Bluff Ranch and what exactly that new wife of Rowan Mercer's was doing out there. The winter had only just started, and the work had only just begun. The first calf was born on a Tuesday in early January, before the sun had cleared the ridge line, in the cold gray half-dark that preceded proper dawn on the high plains. Clara had been checking on Anchor, the older of the 2 pregnant cows, every few hours through the night, sleeping in the barn on a folded horse blanket for the last 2 nights, rather than risk missing the birth. Rowan had told her she didn't have to do that. She had looked at him in the patient way she had when he said things that didn't require a response, and gone back to the barn. The calf came out strong. That was the first thing. Some calves arrived in the world with a kind of tentative quality, as if they hadn't fully committed to being alive yet. This one hit the ground and was trying to stand within minutes, all long legs and stubborn forward motion, shaking the wet from its ears. Clara crouched in the straw beside the cow and watched it, and the feeling that moved through her was not quite triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than that, more like confirmation. She stayed with them until the calf had nursed and both animals had settled. Then she walked back to the house in the cold morning air and found Rowan already up, standing at the stove with coffee, the kind of man who always seemed to know when something was happening without being told. Well, he said. Bull calf, she said. Deep red, good frame, strong from the start. She took the coffee he held out. The cow came through fine. Rowan let out a breath he'd been holding longer than he probably realized. Good, he said. The second cow's close, Clara said. Another week, maybe. She sat down at the table with the coffee and the ledger she'd left open the night before. This changes the math. How so? She turned the ledger so he could see. She'd been running projections for weeks, column after column of careful numbers, breeding timelines, projected calf weights, estimated market values at 2 years and 3 years out. He'd looked at some of it before, but never with the context that now made it real. "That calf," she said, tapping the page, "if he develops the way I expect, and I won't know for certain for another 6 months, he could be worth 4 to 6 times what a standard range calf sells for. To the right buyer for breeding purposes, considerably more." She looked up. 2 years from now, if we run this operation the way I intend to run it, we could be selling not cattle but genetics. Buyers who want to improve their own herds, ranchers who need breeding stock that can perform on marginal pasture. She paused. There are a lot of marginal pastures in this territory. Rowan looked at the numbers. He wasn't a numbers man by nature. His instincts were physical, tactile, rooted in the feel of land and animals and weather. But he was not stupid, and what he saw in Clara's ledger was coherent. It held together. It made a kind of sense that the last 18 months of his life had not. "You really think this works?" he said. "I think it can work," she said. "If we do the things we need to do and don't do the things we shouldn't, yes." He sat down across from her. "What do we need to do?" She turned the ledger back toward herself. "The north pasture needs to rest until at least August. We can't put animals back on it before then, or we lose the grass recovery. The south pasture is carrying the herd fine right now, but it'll need rotation come spring. I want to split it into thirds and move the animals through it on a 4-week cycle." She tapped her pencil against the page. "The fence on the east boundary is still a problem. The wire Haskell ordered should be here next week. I want it up before the ground freezes any deeper." "That's all ranch work," Rowan said. "I can do that." "I know you can," she said. "The other thing is Sloan." His jaw tightened slightly at the name. "What about him?" "He sent another letter last week," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the envelope on the table. Rowan hadn't mentioned it, and she hadn't pushed. She understood that some men needed to carry certain weights privately for a while before they could set them down. "What's the new payment schedule?" "He wants $40 a month starting in February," Rowan said. His voice was flat and careful. "Or he says he'll begin foreclosure proceedings in March." Clara absorbed this. $40 a month was not a number she couldn't work with eventually. The cattle sale had helped, and she'd been keeping expenses disciplined in ways Rowan had initially found jarring. But February was 6 weeks away, and the cattle operation wouldn't generate meaningful income until at least spring, more likely summer. "How much do you have right now?" she asked. $93. "I have 41, she said. He looked up at her. "I brought savings from Laramie," she said, without particular emotion. "I wasn't going to mention it unless we needed it." She paused. "We need it. Between us, that's $134. If we pay him the 40 in February and hold the rest, it gives us until April before we're short again. By April, the second calf should be on the ground and doing well. If I can arrange a showing for potential buyers in late spring—" "A showing," Rowan said slowly. "Some ranchers do it. They bring buyers to see the animals rather than selling at auction. You get better prices. You get buyers who actually understand what they're looking at." She paused. "I've written to 2 men I knew through my uncle. One is in Colorado, one is in Nebraska. They know breeding cattle. If I can get them here in May or June—" "You've already written to them," he said. She met his eyes. "I wrote in November. I wanted to know if the interest was there before I said anything." She held his gaze. "I should have mentioned it sooner. I don't always tell things in the right order." Rowan was quiet for a moment. There was something moving behind his eyes that she couldn't read entirely. Not anger, she didn't think, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of having things happen around him that he hadn't been consulted on. "I appreciate what you're doing," he said finally, carefully. "I do. But this is still my ranch, Clara. If you're making arrangements, writing letters, planning showings, I need to know." "You're right," she said, simply, not defensively. "I'll tell you next time." He nodded once, then, "What did they say? The men you wrote to?" The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile. "Both of them are interested." February arrived with the specific cruelty that February in Wyoming specialized in. Not just cold, but aggressive about it. A wind that came off the mountains with personal intent and found every gap in every wall in coat and resolve. The second calf came on the 8th, a heifer this time, smaller than the bull calf but compact and alert, with the same deep red coloring that Clara had started to think of as the ranch's signature. She went in the ledger as entry 2, with detailed notes on her conformation and the observable traits that matched the expected shorthorn influence. Deke watched Clara examine the heifer the morning after her birth, with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from where it had started in October. "You're going to name her something, aren't you?" he said. "Even if you won't admit it." Clara glanced up. "No. You named the other one." "I gave him a notation number," she said. "You called him something in the barn the other night when you thought nobody was listening." She went back to examining the heifer. "I don't know what you're talking about." Deke smiled into his mustache and said nothing more about it. The truth was that the calf she'd been calling, privately, in her own head, never allowed where it counted, Signal, because he was the first proof that her reading of the herd had been right, that the gamble was paying out, that she hadn't steered Rowan into ruin on the strength of her own confidence and a handful of old papers in a dusty office. She wasn't sentimental about animals. She'd learned early that sentimentality and good breeding decisions were not compatible. But she was human, and the bull calf represented something she needed to acknowledge privately before she could let it go and keep working. She let it go. She kept working. The payment to Edgar Sloan went out in the 3rd week of February. Clara walked it into town herself, which had not been the plan. Rowan had intended to go, but he'd come down with a chest cold that had settled deep and made him sound like a man breathing through wet cloth, and Clara had told him flatly that he was not riding 6 miles in February wind with a cold that sounded like that. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. "Stay in. I'll go." It's not something a woman should have to do," he said, which told her that he was sick enough to say things he'd normally have the sense not to say. She looked at him from the doorway. "Rowan, stay in." She made the trip herself, Cass driving the wagon while she sat in the back with a blanket in her account ledger. The bank was a narrow storefront building on Black Ridge's main street, with gilt lettering on the window that caught the thin winter sun and made it look more prosperous than it probably was. Edgar Sloan received her in his office, a small, carefully arranged room that smelled of wood polish and ambition, and his surprise at seeing her instead of Rowan lasted only a moment before being replaced by a smooth, professional courtliness that she found immediately suspicious. Edgar Sloan was a compact man in his early 50s, well-dressed in the manner of a man who considered good dress to be an instrument rather than a pleasure. He had small eyes that moved quickly, the kind of eyes that were always calculating something, and he smiled with a warmth that didn't reach them. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, rising, "what a pleasant surprise. I'd expected your husband." "He's not well," she said. She set the envelope on his desk. "February payment, $40. I'll need a receipt." He looked at the envelope. Something moved briefly across his face that she couldn't quite name. "Of course," he said pleasantly. He wrote the receipt with careful, deliberate penmanship, blotted it, and handed it across. "How is the ranch coming along? I've heard you've been making some changes." "A few," she said, taking the receipt and folding it into her coat. "I have to say, Mrs. Mercer, I admire your initiative." He said the word with a particular quality that suggested he did not in fact admire it. "Though I hope you haven't been encouraging Rowan to make any dramatic decisions. In difficult circumstances, it's easy to mistake activity for progress." She looked at him steadily. "I appreciate your concern," she said. "The ranch's situation is precarious," he continued, still smiling. "If at any point Rowan decides that the more prudent choice is to settle the remaining debt through a property arrangement—" "He won't," she said. "I have a number of parties who might be interested." "He won't," she said again. She stood. "Thank you for the receipt. You'll have the March payment on time as well." She held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to be a statement of intent rather than a glance, and then left. Outside in the cold, she took one slow breath. Cass was waiting with the wagon, blowing on his hands. "That was fast," he said. "He's not a complicated man," she said, climbing up. "Let's go." But on the ride back, she thought about the quality of that smile, the specific nature of the surprise on his face when she'd put the envelope on his desk. She'd surprised him, not because she'd come instead of Rowan, but because she'd come at all, because the payment existed. She filed that away in the same place she filed things she didn't yet understand, but expected to. The ranch hands from the neighboring Dupree property started showing up at the fence line in late February to watch, not doing anything, just watching, 2 or 3 of them leaning on the east fence some mornings while Clara and Cass ran the cattle through the rotation she'd established. She noticed them after the second day and chose to ignore them. Deke noticed them too. "Dupree's men," he said one morning, pouring coffee in the kitchen. "3rd day running." "I know," she said. "What are they looking for?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but they'll tell somebody, and whoever they tell will probably tell Victor Hale, and then we'll know what he's interested in." Deke looked at her. "You think Hale's behind it?" "He's a man who likes to know what's happening on land near his," she said. "That's not unusual. It just means I'd rather he not know more than necessary for now." "So what do we do?" "We work," she said. "That's all." Victor Hale's interest arrived officially in the 2nd week of March in the form of his ranch manager, a square-jawed, quiet man named Hollis, who rode up to the house on a well-fed bay horse and delivered a message with the smooth professionalism of someone who delivered messages for a living. Mr. Hale had heard that Red Bluff Ranch was running some interesting breeding stock. Mr. Hale would be interested in purchasing the breeding bull if the price was agreeable. Rowan, fully recovered by then, heard this at the front door and looked at Clara across the room. "Tell Mr. Hale the bull isn't for sale," Clara said. Hollis's expression shifted slightly. "Mr. Hale is prepared to be quite generous. He's authorized to offer up to—" "The bull isn't for sale," she said again. Her voice was the same temperature both times. "Mr. Hale wants to discuss a breeding arrangement, leasing rights for a season, that kind of arrangement. He can come discuss it himself. We don't negotiate through messages." Hollis looked at Rowan. The look had a particular quality. "Is she speaking for you?" Rowan held the man's gaze. "You heard her," he said. Hollis left. They watched him ride east toward Hale's property. "He's going to come back," Rowan said. "I know," Clara said. "He's not going to like being told no by a—" He stopped. "By a woman," she finished for him without heat. "No. Men like Victor Hale generally don't." She went back to the table. "That's fine. How he feels about it doesn't change what the bull is worth." Rowan stood at the door a moment longer, watching the road. "You sure we shouldn't at least hear the offer?" "If we sell that bull," she said, without looking up from the ledger, "we sell the heart of what this operation is going to be. Whatever he offers, it's less than what that animal will generate over the next 5 years if we keep him." She paused. "Victor Hale knows exactly what he's looking at. That's why he wants it. The fact that he wants it badly enough to send somebody over here before the snow is even cleared, that's information." He came away from the door, sat down. "What does it tell you?" She looked up then. "That I was right about those cattle," she said, "and that somebody with real experience looked at them and came to the same conclusion." Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it did on the high plains. Not as a single event, but as a gradual negotiation between the land and the season, with setbacks and reversals and a few genuinely warm days that arrived like apologies before retreating again. By April, the North Pasture was showing new growth. Thin, tentative, but real. And Clara extended its rest period anyway, because she'd learned from her uncle that the temptation to return cattle to recovering pasture too early was one of the most common and damaging mistakes a rancher could make. The land would tell you when it was ready. You had to wait for the land. The 2 calves were thriving. The bull calf, Signal in her private accounting, was developing exactly as she'd hoped, growing into his frame with the kind of steady, unhurried progress that reliable animals made. The heifer was smaller, but harder, with an alertness that Clara had noted in the ledger as a temperament observation. She was starting to understand the personalities of each animal on the property in the specific way that came from daily observation over months, not sentimentally, but practically. Knowing an animal's temperament was not a luxury. It was data. The two Colorado and Nebraska ranchers she'd written arrived in the third week of May. She'd prepared for their visit with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. The cattle were in good condition, the pastures clean, the records organized and complete. She'd also prepared Rowan, which had been the more delicate preparation. "They're going to want to see the records," she said the evening before they arrived. "They may ask questions that sound like they're testing you. Just be direct. If you don't know something, say so. Don't try to oversell." He raised an eyebrow. "I know how to talk to ranchers, Clara." "I know you do," she said. "I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying don't let them push you on price before we're ready." She paused. "I'll handle the price conversation." He was quiet a moment. "You're going to negotiate the price?" "Yes." Another pause. "All right," he said. She looked at him, checking the tone. It wasn't resentment, she decided. It was adjustment. The ongoing, difficult process of reordering what a man had assumed was his domain. She understood that. It wasn't nothing to her that it cost him something. She just needed him to do it anyway. "Thank you," she said, simply. He nodded and went to check on the cattle. The visit lasted 2 days. Both men, a thick-set rancher from Colorado named Patterson and a quieter observational man from Nebraska named Voss, who said little but watched everything, spent most of the first day with the cattle. Clara walked them through the herd, explaining bloodlines, showing them the records, answering questions with the directness that she'd found men either appreciated or couldn't tolerate, with little middle ground. Patterson asked good questions. Voss asked fewer but sharper ones. By the end of the first day, she had a sense of where each man's interest centered, which allowed her to shape the second day accordingly. The price conversations happened separately, which she'd planned for. Patterson wanted the young bull calf, an offer she declined. She explained in terms she chose carefully that the bull was the foundation of the breeding program and was not available for purchase. What was available was a breeding arrangement for the following season, defined access, documented results, a structured agreement that protected both parties' interests. Patterson pushed back. She listened to the pushback and said the same thing again in slightly different words. He agreed to the arrangement. Voss was interested in purchasing the heifer at 2 years old, conditional on her development meeting certain benchmarks. Clara wrote the conditions into a letter of intent herself at the kitchen table while both men watched. When she pushed it across for their signatures, Patterson laughed, not unkindly. "You do this for a living?" he asked. "I'm learning," she said. Rowan, who'd been sitting to the side, met her eyes briefly across the table. She looked back at the letter and picked up the pen. "Fun." After the visitors left, Rowan stood in the yard and looked at the letter of intent in his hand for a long moment. Clara came out and stood beside him. "That's a contract," he said. "Yes," she said, "with a Nebraska rancher, for an animal that's currently 4 months old." 3 months and 22 days, she said. He looked at her sideways. She kept her face straight, but only barely. "Clara," he said, in a tone that wasn't quite anything she could name, not anger, not admiration, somewhere in that complicated territory between the two. "When you came here in October, what did you think was going to happen?" She considered the question genuinely, the way she considered most things. "I thought it was possible this could work," she said. "I wasn't certain." "And now?" She looked at the pasture, the cattle grazing on the south section, the fence line that had been a disaster 4 months ago and was now solid, the creek running properly in its channel, signal moving among the other animals with the unhurried confidence of a young animal who'd never known hunger or crowding. "Now I'm less certain," she said. He blinked. "Less certain? We signed something that could work out very well," she said, "or something could go wrong. One of the calves could get sick. The weather could turn bad at the wrong moment. Hale could find a way to make trouble." She was quiet for a moment. "Certainty is what you feel before things get difficult. What I feel now is attention, like I need to watch closely and not assume anything is settled." He looked at her profile. The serious face, the dark eyes tracking across the pasture with that perpetual focus. He'd been watching that face for 7 months now, and felt that he was just beginning to understand it. "That," he said, might be the most unsettling thing you've ever said to me. I say unsettling things fairly regularly, she said. You do, he agreed. They stood there a while. The afternoon was mild for May, the light coming in low and gold over the ridge, the kind of afternoon that made you forget temporarily that anything was difficult. Rowan was aware that he was standing beside his wife, who was also something more than his wife, and something other than what he'd expected when he'd written those letters to the agency in Cheyenne. He was aware that this had stopped being merely a practical arrangement sometime in the last few months and had become something harder to categorize, which was its own particular challenge. He didn't say any of that. Neither did she. But she didn't move away when their shoulders were almost touching in the low afternoon light, and he took that for what it was. Inside the barn, the bull calf moved along the fence line with the easy confidence of an animal who did not yet know that he was the most carefully watched creature in the county, that a banker in town was waiting for this operation to fail, that a cattle baron to the east had sent a man to look at him through a fence and report back, that two ranchers from outside the territory had just signed their names to a paper based largely on what this animal might become. He just walked the fence line and flicked flies with his tail. The work at Red Bluff wasn't done, but it was beginning, genuinely, irreversibly beginning. And Clara felt that in the way she felt the things she couldn't quite prove yet but knew in the deep, patient place where real knowledge lived. That night she made a new entry in the ledger, the letter of intent with Patterson, the breeding arrangement with Voss, the current condition of each animal, the projected rotation schedule for June and July, the date the east fence wire had been finished and signed off on. Everything exact, everything documented, everything in its proper place. Then she closed the ledger and went to bed. Tomorrow there would be more work. There always was. The bulls were gone on a Wednesday morning in late June, and Clara knew it before she reached the barn. She couldn't have explained exactly what told her, some combination of the way the cattle were moving in the south pasture, the specific quality of the silence from the direction of the holding pen, the angle of the gate she could see from the kitchen window that was wrong by 3 feet. She'd been awake since 4:30 anyway, the way she usually was, and she'd been standing at the window with her first coffee watching the gray pre-dawn light come up over the ridge when she noticed it. She set the coffee down and went out without waking Rowan. The holding pen gate was open. The 2 shorthorn cross steers were gone. Signal was gone. The 3 animals she'd been building the entire operation around, the animals she'd written letters about and negotiated contracts for and watched over through 2 Wyoming winters, gone. The pen itself showed the signs of a careful operation. No broken posts, no torn fencing, no evidence of panic or struggle. Someone had known how to move cattle quietly, in the dark, without alarming the rest of the herd. She stood at the open gate for a moment. Then she crouched down in the soft dirt just inside the pen. The tracks were clear enough. 3 sets of hoof prints moving north through the gate, and beside them, human boot prints, 2 sets, moving with purpose. The prints went north along the fence line, toward the open range boundary where the east fence met the corner post. Clara straightened up, went back to the house, and woke Rowan. "Get up," she said. "The bulls are gone." He was dressed in 4 minutes. She was already back outside. She tracked them on foot for the first half mile, reading the ground in the early light with a focus that Rowan, following behind her, found both impressive and deeply unsettling. She moved fast but not carelessly, stopping every 100 yards or so to check the direction, to look at how the grass was disturbed, to read the spacing between prints. 3 animals, she said, not slowing down. 2 men on foot. They came in from the east. See here. The boot prints come in from the fence line. They don't come from our yard. She pointed at the ground without looking up. They knew where the holding pen was. They knew which animals they were taking. "Hail," Rowan said. It wasn't a question. "Maybe," she said. "Keep moving." The trail bent northeast across the open range, angling toward a dry creek bed that ran parallel to the Hale property boundary. Clara followed it with the kind of steady, ground-eating pace that came not from urgency, but from certainty. She knew where she was going. She just hadn't arrived yet. The sun was fully up by the time they reached the creek bed, and in the soft silt of the bank, the tracks became almost reading material, clear and detailed and damning. 2 horses had been waiting at the creek. The cattle had been loaded. She could see where they'd been pushed up a narrow cut in the bank, the disturbed earth on either side showing the animals had resisted briefly. And the horses had moved north and east at a walk, which meant they weren't panicked, which meant they had time, which meant they'd been doing this for a while before anyone noticed. "They have maybe 5-6 hours on us," she said. Rowan's jaw was tight. "I'll get the horses." "Wait." She was looking at the tracks. Something was bothering her, a detail she couldn't immediately resolve. She crouched at the edge of the bank and looked at the horse prints, large, well-shod, regular shoes with no distinctive marks. Then at the boot prints of the men on foot, one set heavier than the other. The lighter set had a specific wear pattern on the outside edge of the heel that she'd seen before recently, and she searched her memory for it. The ranch manager. Hollis. The square-jawed man who'd ridden the well-fed bay horse to her door in March and delivered Victor Hale's offer. She stood up. "Get the horses," she said, "and get the Dupree boy's rifle from the bunkhouse." "Clara, I'm not going to shoot anyone," she said. "I'm going to retrieve our cattle." They found them 7 miles northeast, in a makeshift holding area inside a stand of cottonwoods on the far edge of land that didn't clearly belong to anyone. The kind of marginal territory that existed between established properties and that men like Victor Hale understood could be used for temporary purposes without immediate legal consequence. The 3 animals were in reasonable condition, mildly stressed but unhurt, penned with rough ropes strung between trees. 2 men were with them. One Clara didn't recognize. The other was Hollis. She rode in ahead of Rowan at a walk, which she thought was important. Coming in fast meant someone made a fast decision, and fast decisions in these situations were usually the wrong kind. She came in slowly, which put her in control of the pace, which meant she was in control of what happened next. Hollis saw her and went very still in the way men went still when they were recalculating. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Hollis," she said. She stopped her horse about 20 feet from him. "Those are our cattle." "These animals were found wandering on open range," he said. He had the smooth delivery of a man who'd had a cover story prepared. "Mr. Hale is holding them for safekeeping pending identification." "The bull calf has a notch in his left ear from where he caught it on fence wire in February," Clara said. "My husband made the same notch in our holding pen post so we'd have a matching record. The older steer has a scar across his right shoulder from a barbed wire encounter last autumn. I have a dated entry in my breeding ledger describing it." She kept her voice level. "Both identifying marks are documented and dated before today. Shall we go to the sheriff and discuss identification?" A silence. The second man shifted his weight. Hollis looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had underestimated the wrong person. "It appears there may have been a misunderstanding," he said finally. "It appears so," she said. She looked at Rowan, who had come up beside her, the rifle across his saddle. "We'll take our cattle home now." Hollis stepped back. The second man stepped back. Rowan moved around them and opened the rope pen while Clara kept her position and her eyes steady. Getting the cattle moving took a few minutes. They were unsettled. Signal in particular was edgy from the stress of the night. But once they were moving, they moved. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said another word. They rode the 7 miles back in near silence, both of them managing the cattle. It wasn't until they were on Red Bluff land again, the animals back in the holding pen with the gate properly secured, that Rowan finally said what he'd been working on for the entire ride. "We can't prove it was Hale," he said. "No," she agreed. "Hollis works for him, but Hollis won't say it was on Hale's orders." "No," she agreed again. He looked at her. "So what do we do?" She was checking the gate latch for the 3rd time, a small, compulsive gesture she made when she was thinking. "We document everything," she said. "The tracks, the location, the time, what Hollis said. We write it all down today while it's fresh. We asked Tom Pryor at the feed store if he sold any rope to strangers recently, and we asked the Dupree hands if they saw anything last night." She paused. "And we move the cattle." "Move them where?" "Into the main barn at night," she said. "It's inconvenient, but it's the only way I trust." She finally stopped checking the latch and looked at him. "We're not going to win a fight with Victor Hale through confrontation. He has more money, more men, and more political connection than we do." She met his eyes. "We win by making sure there's nothing here he can take." Rowan stared at the holding pen. She could see him working through the anger. There was real anger there, the particular fury of a man who felt his property and his dignity had been violated simultaneously, and working through it towards something more useful. "All right," he said tightly. "And there's something else," she said. Her voice had changed slightly, dropped into a different register, more careful. "Something I found." He turned to look at her. "Come inside," she said. "I need to show you something in the records." 3 weeks earlier, going through the original papers in the ranch office for the third time, she had a habit of returning to primary documents when she felt something was off. Claire had found, tucked into the back of the folder that contained the original mortgage agreement with the Black Ridge County Bank, a handwritten calculation that hadn't been there before, or rather, that she hadn't noticed before. A column of figures, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, worked out on a scrap of paper that had been folded into the folder and was the same age as the documents around it. She'd spent 2 evenings with that piece of paper and her own calculations before she understood what she was looking at. Now she spread the papers on the kitchen table, the original mortgage, the payment receipts, her own reconstruction of what those payments should have been, and walked Rowan through it carefully. The mortgage his father had signed in 1886 specified an interest rate of 8% per annum, compounded annually. Standard for the era, maybe slightly high, but not outrageous. The payments that Edgar Sloan had recorded in the bank's ledger, which Clara had obtained a partial copy of by the simple expedient of asking Sloan's clerk for confirmation of the outstanding balance and being handed more than Sloan had probably intended, showed interest calculations that didn't match 8%. They showed calculations consistent with a rate of somewhere between 11 and 12%. The difference, compounded over 5 years, was not small. "He's been overcharging us," Rowan said. He said it slowly, like a man trying the idea on to see if it fit. "Overcharging your father, and then you," Clara said. "And if he did it to your father's account—" She set another paper on top. "I asked Patterson, when he was here in May, about his bank arrangements. He mentioned casually that his mortgage with Black Ridge County was giving him fits. He's been paying for 7 years, and the principal barely moves." Rowan stared at the papers. "You think Sloan has been doing this to multiple accounts?" "I think it's possible," she said carefully. "I can't prove it with what I have. I would need to see other ranchers' payment records alongside their original agreements." She paused. "But if someone were systematically miscalculating interest rates across multiple accounts and doing it in a way that looked like clerical error rather than deliberate fraud, it would take a long time for anyone to notice, because most people trust the bank's arithmetic and don't keep their own parallel records." The room was very quiet. "Your father kept some of his own records," she said gently. "Not complete ones, but enough that I can see the discrepancy." She looked at him. "I think your father's debt was never as large as Sloan told him it was. I think some of what he sold off, cattle, equipment, was sold to cover a debt that was partly fictional." Rowan sat back in his chair. The anger she'd seen earlier at the holding pen was still there, but it had changed shape. It was colder now, harder, the difference between a fire and an iron. "If I go to Sloan with this," he started, "he'll say it was a clerical error, easily corrected, deeply regretted," she said. "And if it's just us, with our records, against the county bank, we lose that argument." She paused. "But if other ranchers have the same discrepancy in their records—" "The county meeting," he said. 1st of August. Every rancher in the region is there for the grazing rights discussion." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking about this since May," he said. Not accusatory, just placing it. "Since May, yes," she admitted. "I didn't want to say anything until I was more certain. I'm still not certain enough, but after what happened last night—" She gathered the papers carefully. "Sloan was expecting this ranch to fail. He told me as much. The way careful men tell you things without telling you things. If he's been running this kind of calculation across multiple accounts, then every struggling rancher in this county is struggling partly because of him." She looked up. "That's not something I can sit on." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the morning was fully underway. Deke's voice, some distance away, calling to Cass about something in the south pasture. The ordinary sounds of a ranch at work. "What do you need?" he said. Time, she said, and other ranchers' records. I need to talk to some people without it getting back to Sloan before the August meeting. He nodded slowly. I know men in this county who've been fighting that bank for years, he said. Men who thought they were bad at arithmetic or had bad luck or... He stopped. I'll set up the conversations. You talk to them. She nodded. Rowan, this is going to make Sloan into an enemy if we pursue it. He was already an enemy, he said. I just didn't know it yet. The next 6 weeks were the most demanding Clara had experienced since arriving at Red Bluff, and that was saying something. She was managing the ranch through its most critical summer, the cattle rotation, the continued rehabilitation of the north pasture, the daily monitoring of the breeding animals, correspondence with Patterson and Voss about the fall arrangements, while simultaneously conducting what amounted to a quiet private investigation into the financial records of 5 neighboring ranching families. Rowan opened the doors. He had relationships in this county that went back to his father's time, the deep practical connections that frontier communities built between families who'd weathered the same hard seasons. He rode out to see men he hadn't spoken to in a year, partly from pride and partly from the particular shame of failing at something a man felt he should have been able to handle alone. He came back with invitations for Clara. She went to 3 ranching families over the course of a month. The Fords, the Crawleys, and an older widow named Hester Maines, who ran a small operation north of town entirely alone and had been fighting the bank's accounting for 2 years on the grounds that something was wrong. She just couldn't say exactly what. Clara sat at kitchen tables with these people and looked at their papers with them, patiently, without telling them more than she'd confirmed. She asked questions and listened to answers and wrote down figures and checked arithmetic, and each time she found the same pattern, payments recorded at rates that didn't match signed agreements, discrepancies small enough per month to seem like rounding errors but large enough per year to materially affect the debt trajectory. Hester Maines, who was 71 and had the sharpness of a woman who'd been underestimated her entire life, spread her papers on her kitchen table and watched Clara work through them and said, I knew it. I've been telling everyone for 2 years something was wrong, and they kept saying I was confused. You weren't confused, Clara said. Will anyone listen? Not if it's just one of us, Clara said. If it's all of us, with documentation? Yes. I think so. Hester looked at the papers, then at Clara. You're Rowan Mercer's wife, she said. The one everyone said was going to ruin his ranch. Yes, Clara said. Said Hester, in a tone that contained a full editorial. By the time the county meeting arrived on the 1st of August, Clara had documented discrepancies across 4 accounts in addition to Rowan's. She had original signed agreements, bank-issued payment records, and her own recalculations laid out in a ledger she'd started specifically for this purpose. Clean, organized, cross-referenced, the kind of document that would be very difficult for a man who claimed the errors were minor to dismiss in public. She'd also, very quietly, written to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne about the proper procedures for challenging a bank's accounting practices. The response had been informative. The night before the meeting, she sat at the kitchen table going through the ledger one final time. Rowan came in from the last check on the cattle and sat across from her. He looked tired. It had been a hard summer in every direction, but there was something else in his face that she'd been watching develop over the past month. A kind of steadiness. He'd been angry after the theft of the bulls, and he'd been worried about the bank, and he'd been adjusting to the ongoing experience of having a wife who operated with significant independence. But underneath all of that, increasingly, was something that she could only describe as trust. Not the unconditional trust that people gave easily at the beginning of things and then had to walk back. The harder, more durable kind that developed from watching someone be right about things over time. How bad is it? He asked, nodding at the ledger. Across 5 accounts, the excess interest charged over the past 5 to 8 years comes to somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000, she said. For some families, it's the difference between solvency and the position they're currently in. He was quiet. There's one more thing, she said. Something I found in the Crawley records that I haven't mentioned yet. She turned the ledger to show him a specific page. Their original mortgage has an amendment, signed in 1888. The amendment changes the compounding terms. Mr. Crawley says he never signed an amendment. He showed me his copy of the original agreement, which has no amendment. She looked up. The bank's copy of the agreement has an amendment that the rancher's copy doesn't. Rowan stared at her. He falsified the documents. Someone did, she said carefully. I'm not going to say more than that until we're in front of people who can act on it. She closed the ledger. But that's not a clerical error anymore. They sat with that for a moment. You know what he's going to do tomorrow, Rowan said, when you stand up in that meeting. Yes, she said. He's going to try to make you look foolish. He's going to say you're a woman who doesn't understand finance. He's going to say the calculations are wrong. He's going to be very polite and very crushing about it. I know, she said, and you're going to do it anyway. She looked at him. Are you asking me not to? He shook his head. No, he said. I'm asking if you're ready. She looked back at the ledger, thought about Hester Maine saying I knew it, thought about the Crawley family's children who'd grown up on a ranch that was being quietly bled by a man they trusted, thought about Rowan's father, who'd sold cattle he'd spent years building in order to cover a debt that was being artificially inflated. I'm ready, she said. The county meeting was held in the Grange Hall, a long, low building on the south end of Black Ridge that smelled of old wood and collective anxiety. 63 people attended, ranchers, farmers, a few merchants from town. Edgar Sloan was there in his good suit, seated near the front with the comfortable positioning of a man who expected the proceedings to concern other people. Clara sat near the back with Rowan and Hester Maines, who had come with her own folder of papers and the expression of a woman prepared to say exactly what she thought. The grazing rights discussion took an hour. It was contentious and circular in the way that grazing rights discussions always were, and Clara listened to it with one part of her attention while the larger part of her mind was organizing what came next. When the floor opened for general business, she stood up. The room noticed her in the particular way that rooms notice something unexpected. A few people turned. Edgar Sloan, from his position near the front, turned as well, and when he saw who was standing, something moved briefly across his face before the professional warmth settled back into place. Mrs. Mercer, said the meeting chair, a farmer named Aldous, who had the diplomatic instincts of a man who'd been managing other men's arguments for 20 years. You have something to bring before the county? I do, she said. She was aware of how her voice carried in the room. Steady, not raised, the kind of voice that didn't need to perform confidence because it had the actual thing. I want to discuss the accounting practices at the Black Ridge County Bank. A silence. Then the low, atmospheric sound of 60 people recalibrating their attention. She laid it out clearly. No dramatics, no performance. She'd decided weeks ago that the most effective approach was to be so plainly factual that dismissal became difficult. She described the discrepancy she'd found in the Mercer account. She described the same pattern in 4 other accounts. She named the families who were present and who nodded when their names were said. She described the mathematics line by line in terms that any rancher who'd ever managed a payment schedule could follow. She placed her ledger on the table at the front and invited anyone to check the arithmetic. Edgar Sloan spoke when she paused. He was smooth about it, exactly as Rowan had predicted, courteous and sorrowful and gently condescending, explaining that mortgage accounting was complex, that rounding occurred in standard practice, that he'd be happy to review any specific concerns privately and address any errors that had occurred. Of course, Clara said when he finished. However, private review doesn't address the Crawley Amendment. She kept her eyes on the room, not on Sloan. Mr. and Mrs. Crawley have a copy of their original mortgage agreement signed in 1886 with no amendments. The bank's copy, which I was shown during what Mr. Sloan described as a routine review, contains an amendment to the compounding terms signed in 1888, which the Crawleys say they never signed. She let that sit for a moment. I'd like to ask Mr. Sloan to produce both copies before this room today so that we can examine them together. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any that had come before it. Sloan's composure held, but it held the way ice holds over moving water, visibly, with effort. I don't carry bank documents to public meetings, Mrs. Mercer, he said. That's not standard practice. No, she said agreeably, which is why I've asked the Territorial Land Office to send an examiner to Black Ridge. She produced a letter from the Land Office, which she'd received the previous week, and held it up. They've agreed, given the concerns raised, to review the bank's mortgage records against the rancher's copies. The examiner arrives Thursday. The room erupted. Not in her favor, not entirely. Eruptions were complicated things, and this one contained alarm and skepticism, and a few voices raised in Sloane's defense. But it also contained the voices of men and women who'd been quietly furious for years at a debt that never seemed to shrink the way it should, and those voices were louder than she'd expected. Hester Maine said something very pointed from the third row. Tom Crawley stood up and said he'd been asking the bank for an explanation for 3 years and never received a clear one. Clara stood quietly at the front and let it happen. She'd done what she'd come to do. The room would work itself out. Rowan, from his seat near the back, watched his wife stand in front of 60 people while Edgar Sloane's composure came apart at the edges, and the room sorted itself into camps, and felt something move through him that he hadn't expected and couldn't easily name. Not pride exactly, or not only pride. Something more like recognition, like finally seeing clearly what had been in front of him since October, in a barn, in the dark before dawn, in the crouched form of a woman reading hoof prints in soft dirt with total concentration. He hadn't understood back then what he'd agreed to when he'd said yes to that letter from the agency in Cheyenne. He understood it better now. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. Edgar Sloane left before it ended, which told everyone present what they needed to know. Clara stayed until the last person finished speaking, answered questions when they were directed at her, and acknowledged what she didn't yet know with the same directness she brought to everything else. When it was finally over and the room began to empty, Hester Maines put a hand briefly on her arm, the dry, light grip of an old woman who didn't touch people easily, and said nothing at all, which said everything. Outside in the cooling evening, Rowan came up beside her. They walked to the wagon without talking for a bit, both of them tired in a specific way. The tiredness of tension released all at once. "Thursday," he said finally. "The examiner gets here Thursday." "Yes," she said. "And if they find what you think they'll find..." "Then Sloane has a problem," she said. "A real one. Not a me problem. A territorial examiner problem." He absorbed this. They reached the wagon. He got up first and held out a hand for her, which he'd never done before, and she took it, which she hadn't expected to do, and they both pretended this was a practical matter of getting into a wagon, and neither of them said anything about it. "The bull," she said when they were moving. "I want to check on him when we get back." "I figured," he said. "And I want to change the holding pen setup. I've been thinking about..." "Clara." She stopped. "The bull is fine," he said. "Deke checked him an hour ago. He's fine." She closed her mouth. "The ranch is fine tonight," he said. "You did something today that you can't undo and that needed doing, and the ranch is fine tonight. Just let it be fine for one evening." She looked at him sideways in the last of the evening light. He was looking at the road ahead, jaw set, hands easy on the reins, and she thought about what it had cost him to be in that room today, watching someone else fight the battle that he'd carried alone for too long before she arrived. "All right," she said. "One evening." They drove home in the dark, and the road stretched north under a sky full of stars, and the ranch waited for them at the end of it. 14 cattle, 2 calves, 1 recovered creek, 1 healing pasture, and a ledger full of careful numbers that had just changed the direction of more lives than Clara had fully intended when she'd started writing things down. The territorial examiner arrived on Thursday as promised, a thin, precise man named Aldridge, who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and carried a leather satchel that he treated with the reverence other men reserved for firearms. He spent 4 days at the Black Ridge County Bank going through mortgage ledgers with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the truth in financial records was always in the small numbers, the ones people stopped checking because they seemed too minor to matter. Clara didn't speak to him during those 4 days. She went about the ranch work and waited, which was harder than any physical labor she'd done since October. Rowan watched her manage the waiting with the focused discipline she brought to everything and said nothing about it, which was the right call. The examiner's preliminary findings came back to the county on a Monday morning. Clara heard about them secondhand through Hester Maines, who had a gift for receiving information quickly that Clara had come to appreciate. The findings were not preliminary in any meaningful sense. They were as definitive as a man like Aldridge was going to commit to before the formal report, which meant they were definitive. Systematic overcharging across 11 accounts. Records amended without borrower signatures on at least 3 agreements. One account, the Crawleys, showing alterations that Aldridge described to the county clerk as inconsistent with standard clerical correction. Edgar Sloan, by Thursday of that week, had retained a lawyer from Cheyenne. By the following Monday, the word that moved through Black Ridge was that Sloan was cooperating with the territorial examination in exchange for terms that had not yet been publicly disclosed. What was publicly disclosed, through a notice posted on the door of the county clerk's office, was that mortgage accounts under review would have their payments suspended pending recalculation, and that ranchers with concerns about their accounts should present their original documentation to the examiner's temporary office in the Grange Hall. Hester Maines was first in line when the office opened at 8 in the morning. She brought every piece of paper she'd kept for 2 years in a flour sack tied with kitchen twine, and she set it on the examiner's table with the satisfaction of a woman who had been right all along and knew it. Clara heard about this from Rowan, who'd ridden into town that morning for wire and come back with news instead. He told her about it in the yard, standing by the wagon with his hat in his hands, and she listened with the stillness she brought to things that mattered. "Sloan's not going to fight it," Rowan said. "At least that's what people are saying. The lawyer from Cheyenne is there to negotiate the repayment, not to contest the findings." "That's the right decision for him," Clara said. "Contesting it publicly would mean every rancher in the territory hearing about it in detail." "Ford says his excess payments go back 7 years," Rowan said. 7 years, Clara. That's nearly everything he sold in that time going to cover a debt that was wrong." She nodded. She'd known the Ford numbers before Rowan had. She'd been the one to sit with Emmett Ford and his wife at their kitchen table and work through the arithmetic. But hearing Rowan say it, with the particular heaviness that came from a man understanding that something systemic had been done to people he knew, was different. "What happens to Sloan?" he asked. "I don't know exactly," she said. "The territorial examiner can refer to the sheriff. Whether he does depends on what the full review shows and whether the amended documents can be proven intentional." She paused. "At minimum, he repays what he overcharged and loses the bank's operating authority. That's already more than most of those families expected a week ago." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You saved some of those people their ranches," he said. "They saved their own ranches," she said. "They kept their records." He looked at her with an expression she'd learned to recognize over the past 10 months, the one that meant he was going to say something and was deciding whether to say it now or later. This time he chose later, turning back toward the wagon to unload the wire he'd managed to buy despite the distraction of county news. Clara went back to the barn, but she noticed that he'd paused just briefly before turning away, and she filed that away in the same private ledger where she kept the things that weren't yet ready to be examined directly. Odds. The celebration, such as it was, happened that Friday evening when Hester Maines showed up at the Red Bluff Ranch unannounced with a jar of preserved plums and the information that the Ford family and the Crawleys were coming as well. Rowan looked at Clara when Hester arrived. Clara looked at Rowan. "Apparently we're having people over," he said. "Apparently," she said. It was the closest thing to a party the ranch had seen in years, which wasn't saying much. 6 adults, Cass looking overwhelmed in the corner, a kitchen table too small for the number of people around it. But there was a quality to the evening that Clara recognized as genuine relief. The specific loosening that happened when something people had been carrying in secret turned out to be real, to be shared, to be addressed. Tom Crawley shook Clara's hand for a long time and couldn't seem to find words. His wife, a small woman named June, who Clara had met once during the records process, found them. She thanked Clara plainly and directly, without drama, and Clara was more moved by that than she'd expected. Hester ate 2 portions of everything and held court from her chair near the kitchen door, delivering opinions on Edgar Sloan's character that she'd apparently been composing for years and was finally at liberty to share. "I told my husband in 1882 that man had small eyes," she announced to the room. "Eyes too close together. You can't trust a man whose eyes are too close together." "That's not a reliable method of character assessment," Clara said. "It's worked for me for 40 years, Hester said comfortably. Deke, sitting against the wall with his coffee, said nothing, but his mustache moved in a way that suggested he was choosing not to express an opinion. It was a good evening, not uncomplicated. There was grief underneath the relief, the slow emerging grief of people understanding how much they'd lost and over how long a time. But good. Clara sat at her own kitchen table among people she hadn't known a year ago and felt the particular unsteady warmth of belonging she hadn't expected to find here. After everyone had gone, she and Rowan cleaned up in the kitchen together, which had become a quiet habit over the months, each of them taking their established part of the task without discussion. He washed, she dried. It was a very ordinary thing, and she'd stopped noticing how much she relied on the ordinariness of it. "Hester likes you," Rowan said. "Hester likes anyone who confirms her existing opinions," Clara said. "She brought you preserved plums," he said. "She doesn't do that for people she just likes. She does it for people she respects." Clara set a cup on the shelf. "How do you know her well enough to know the difference?" "She brought my mother plums the year she helped dig out the Ford barn after the fire," he said. "One jar, same kind." He handed her the next cup. "It means something, coming from Hester." Clara held the cup for a moment. "Your mother sounds like she was capable," she said. "She was," he said. "Ran this house and half the ranch operation from the time my father's back gave out until she died." He was quiet. "She would have liked you." Clara set the cup on the shelf carefully. "That's a generous thing to say." "It's a true thing," he said. Not sentimental about it. Just a fact he'd decided to deliver. They finished the dishes in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the early silences had been. Not the careful quiet of two strangers managing their proximity, but the more comfortable quiet of people who'd run out of necessary things to say and were fine with the absence. Victor Hale moved in mid-September. Clara found out about it the way she found out about most things. Not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of small signals that she assembled into a picture. Dupree's hands, who'd stopped watching the Red Bluff fence line after the county meeting, started appearing there again in the first week of September. One of them, a young man she'd seen before but didn't know by name, lingered at the east fence for nearly an hour one morning, watching the cattle grazing the south pasture. She noted it. She mentioned it to Rowan, who rode over and had a word with Dupree himself, who claimed to know nothing about it and seemed genuine, which suggested the hands were reporting somewhere other than to their own employer. The second signal was more direct. Hollis appeared at the ranch gate on a Wednesday morning, not riding in this time, just waiting at the gate, hat in hand, with the expression of a man delivering a message he personally found distasteful. The message was that Victor Hale would like to discuss a range management agreement with Rowan Mercer at Mr. Hale's earliest convenience. Clara was standing beside Rowan when Hollis delivered this. She kept her face neutral. "Tell Mr. Hale we're busy through October," Rowan said. Hollis nodded once and left. "He's adjusting his approach," Clara said when the man was out of earshot. "Coming in friendly now," Rowan agreed. "He's watching what's happening with Sloan," she said. "He knows the county is paying attention in ways it wasn't before. Direct action is too visible." She was thinking out loud more than explaining. "He'll try to get something through legitimate channels. A range agreement, an easement offer, something that looks like business." "We don't want any agreements with Victor Hale," Rowan said flatly. "No," she said. "We don't." She looked at the gate. "The cattle are going to be our vulnerability through winter. He knows that." "What do you mean?" She turned toward the pasture. "We're moving into the hard months. The breeding animals are the most valuable things on this property. If something happened to them during a storm, during a cold snap, if they ended up off our land—" She stopped. "It's what he'd try if he was going to try something." Rowan looked at her. "You think he'd drive the cattle off?" "I think a man who'll steal bulls in the night will do whatever he can get away with," she said. "And I think a winter storm gives considerable cover for things that aren't accidents." He was quiet for a long moment, working through it. "We move them back into the barn at night," he said. "Starting now," she said. "Not when the first snow hits. Now." Whoa. October passed in the ordinary hard labor of preparation, hay stacked in the barn loft, fence lines checked and rechecked, The cattle moved indoors each night and back out each morning, a routine that added 2 hours to every day, but that Clara refused to abandon. Deke had stopped arguing with her about the extra work somewhere around midsummer and had transitioned to simply doing what she said, which represented a shift of considerable significance that neither of them discussed directly. Cass had grown 3 inches since October of the previous year and had developed, in the quiet way that young men develop things, a specific reverence for Clara that expressed itself primarily as asking her questions about cattle and writing down her answers in a small notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. She'd noticed the notebook in August and said nothing about it. It seemed like the right thing to do. The first real cold came in the 3rd week of October. Not the worst of it, but the kind of sustained cold that announced itself as permanent. Temperatures that didn't recover during the day. Ground that froze at night and stayed frozen. The cattle made the adjustment well, the shorthorn breeding and the foundation animals giving them a cold tolerance that straight-range cattle lacked. Clara documented the condition of each animal carefully through October, noting changes in weight, coat quality, energy level. Signal was close to 18 months old now and was developing in ways that exceeded even her careful projections. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but steadily, in the accumulating evidence of a good animal reaching its potential. Patterson had written twice in October to confirm the breeding arrangement for the coming spring. Voss had written once, about the heifer, who was now nearly a year old and showing exactly the confirmation Clara had described in the letter of intent. Clara had written back to both men with her characteristic precision and had mentioned carefully that Red Bluff Ranch was developing a second generation of breeding stock that might be of interest in future seasons. Rowan read that letter before she sent it. "Second generation," he said. "You're already planning that far ahead." 2 years out minimum, she said. "Breeding operations are long cycle. You plan today for what you're selling in 3 years. He handed the letter back. "When you came here," he said, "you had a plan for this whole thing, didn't you? A real one. Not just hope." She considered the question honestly. "I had a framework," she said, "based on what I'd read about the Briggs bloodline and what I thought I might find here. But a framework isn't a plan until you see the actual animals." She paused. "I was hoping. I just try not to let hope do the work that thinking should do." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's the most you've ever told me about what it felt like when you came here." She looked back at the letter in her hands. "I was scared," she said, which was harder to say than anything else she'd said to him in a year. "I was coming to a place I'd never seen to marry a man I didn't know, to try to save something that might not be savable." She smoothed the letter. "I didn't let myself think about that part very much." "But you came anyway," he said. "I came anyway," she agreed. The 3rd night of November arrived with weather that had been building for 2 days. A low-pressure system that the old-timers in Black Ridge could read in the color of the afternoon sky and the behavior of animals, that particular electric stillness that preceded the worst storms. Clara had been watching the sky since noon. By 4 in the afternoon, she told Rowan it was going to be serious, and Rowan looked at the sky and didn't argue. They moved the breeding animals into the barn early, before the last of the gray light went. The rest of the herd, the cattle that weren't part of the foundation breeding group, were in the north pasture, which now had good grass and solid fencing, and Clara judged them safe enough in the conditions. The temperature was dropping fast, but not yet dangerous, and range cattle could handle cold if they were in good condition, which these were. She did a last check on the barn animals at 9 in the evening, when the wind had started in earnest and the first hard snow was coming sideways off the ridge. Everything was as it should be. Cattle settled, hay distributed, water not yet frozen in the trough. She went back to the house. The sound that woke her at 2 in the morning was wrong in a specific way. Not the wind, which had been a constant roar for hours. Something underneath the wind, a change in the way the air moved outside, a quality of absence where there should have been presence. She lay in the dark for 3 seconds, identifying it. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. The barn was fine. The breeding animals were all present and accounted for. She stood in the barn doorway and looked north toward the main pasture, and even through the dark and the driving snow, she could read what the land was telling her. The north pasture gate was open. She went back inside and woke Rowan with one hand on his shoulder and 2 words. "They're out." He was dressed before she finished the sentence. They woke Deke and Cass. No one said Victor Hale's name out loud, but it was in the room with them as they pulled on coats and gathered what they'd need. Ropes, lanterns, the rifle that now lived on the hook by the barn door rather than in the bunkhouse. "How many are we talking?" Deke asked at the gate. "The north pasture had 18 animals," Clara said. She was looking into the darkness and the storm with the concentrated stillness of someone working through a problem. "In this weather, with a gate opening behind them, they'll spook. They'll run downwind." "Downwind is northeast," Rowan said. "Northeast is open range," Deke said. 6 miles of nothing before you hit the Hale boundary." "They won't run 6 miles in this," Clara said. "Cattle don't run blind into a storm. They run until they find something to stop against." She was thinking about topography, the land northeast of the ranch, the dry creek bed, the stand of cottonwoods 3 miles out that she'd ridden past a dozen times. "The cottonwoods," she said, "where we found the bulls in June. There's a natural break in the land there, a low cut that blocks wind from the north. Scared cattle in a northeast storm will find that." "That's 3 miles in a blizzard," Cass said. He was 18 and scared, and she appreciated that he said it anyway. "Yes," she said. "It is." Rowan looked at her. "You sure?" "No," she said honestly, "but it's the best reading I have." He looked at the storm for 1 second, maybe 2. Then, "We go northeast. Deke, you and Cass go wide left. Claire and I go straight. We'll hear them before we see them." They rode into the dark and the driving snow, but it was the worst 3 miles Clara had covered on horseback since coming to Wyoming. The wind was the kind that didn't just push you but tried to unmake your thinking, to reduce everything to cold and white and the animal need to stop. She kept her face angled down against it and focused on what she knew. The feel of the ground under her horse's feet, the slight descent that told her they were approaching the creek bed, the specific weight of the air that changed near the cottonwoods. She heard them before she saw them, not loudly. Cattle in a storm don't make dramatic sounds. But there was the particular low restlessness that a gathered, scared herd made, a collective unease that the wind brought to her in pieces. She held up her hand and Rowan, riding beside her, stopped his horse. They listened. "Left," she said. 200 yards, maybe." They found them in the cottonwood break, all 18 of them in various states of frightened stillness, pressed together against the wind shadow of the trees and the low bank of the creek cut. Not injured, not scattered. Present and findable, because Clara had understood where they would go, had understood it because she'd spent a year learning this land the same way she'd learned those cattle, patiently, from the ground up, trusting observation over assumption. Getting them home took 2 hours in the dark and the snow, Deke and Cass appearing out of the storm like ghosts when the sound of cattle moving reached them. It was slow and cold and required the specific quiet competence of experienced hands who knew how to move a frightened herd without making fear worse. Cass did well, better than his 18 years should have allowed, and Clara noted it. They got all 18 home. Everyone. But Rowan closed the north pasture gate behind the last animal at 4:15 in the morning and latched it with a wire wrap that would hold against more than weather. Clara was still on her horse, checking the herd by lantern light, going from animal to animal with the specific focus of someone confirming what they hoped was true. All present, all in reasonable condition, cold and stressed but sound. She let herself breathe. Properly, all the way out, for the first time since 2 in the morning. Deke tied his horse to the fence post and stood for a moment in the snowy dark. He was a man who did not give compliments easily, who had spent his adult life in the company of men who considered expressed admiration a form of weakness. He looked at Clara moving through the recovered herd with her lantern and was quiet for a long time. Then he said to Rowan, not quite quietly enough, "She's the best stockman I've ever worked with, and I've worked with 30 years' worth of them." Rowan heard it. Clara heard it. Neither of them said anything. But Deke had chosen not to be quiet enough deliberately, she thought, and she looked at the old man for a moment across the backs of cattle in the lantern light and gave him a single nod. He nodded back. That was all. The storm blew itself out by morning. The snow left 1.5 feet on the ground and a clean, exhausted silence over everything. The sun came up pale and cold and very clear over the ridge, and the ranch sat under it with all its animals and all its fences and all its careful, documented, defended progress intact. They slept in shifts that day. Clara took the first 3 hours and gave Rowan the next 3 while she checked the cattle. She was on her third cup of coffee and her second review of the breeding ledger when he came back down the stairs at noon, still looking tired in the way sleep hadn't entirely fixed. He poured coffee and sat across from her. She kept reading. He drank. The house was quiet in the way it was sometimes quiet now. Not the careful quiet of the early months, but the natural quiet of people who didn't need to fill space with noise. "The gate," he said eventually. "Yes," she said. "Was wired shut when I checked it yesterday evening," he said. "Before the storm." "I know," she said. "I checked it too." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I don't have proof," he said. "No," she said. "We won't get proof, not the kind that stands up formally. That's how men like Hale operate. They stay a step removed." She turned a page in the ledger. "But the county is watching now in ways it wasn't before. The examiner's report will be finished by December. Sloan's situation has changed what's acceptable in this county, and Hale knows it." She paused. Last night was desperation, a man who thought he could still afford to do what he wanted. "So what do we do?" "Same thing we've been doing," she said. "We document the gate. We document the time. We document that all animals were recovered. We put it on the record." She looked up from the ledger. "And we don't give him a target this vulnerable again. The animals go in the barn every night, all winter, period. No exceptions." He looked at her steadily. "That's more work." "Yes," she said. "Deke's not going to complain." "No," she agreed. "He's not." A silence. The coffee steamed between them. "I heard what he said last night," Rowan said, "about you being the best stockman he'd worked with." She went back to the ledger. "Deke talks when he's cold," she said. "Deke never talks," Rowan said, "but that's what makes it worth noting." He set his cup down. "Clara, look at me a moment." She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the working through it look, not the adjustment look, not the careful look of a man managing what she cost him. Something more direct than any of those. "When I wrote to that agency in Cheyenne," he said, "I was trying to solve a problem. That's all I was thinking about. I wasn't thinking about anything other than whether someone could help keep this place from going under." He paused. "I want you to know that's not how I think about it anymore. About you." She held his gaze. Outside, wind moved the snow off the barn roof in a white drift that caught the sunlight briefly before falling. "Rowan," she said carefully. "I'm not asking you to say anything," he said. "I just wanted you to know." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the ledger, and her hand rested on the open page, and she didn't turn it. "I know," she said quietly. It wasn't much, but the way she said it, the way her hand stayed still on the page rather than moving on to the next task. It was more than he'd had before, and he understood the value of incremental progress as well as anyone who'd spent a year watching a ruined ranch slowly become something else. He got up and refilled his coffee. She turned the page. The cattle outside moved through the clean snow, and the north pasture gate held firm on its new latch, and the Red Bluff Ranch went on becoming what Clara had seen in the early October dark of a dying operation, that it might be. The Territorial Examiner's final report arrived in Black Ridge on a Wednesday in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, and it was worse for Edgar Sloan than even Clara had projected. 11 accounts. Systematic overcharging across a period of 8 years. 3 mortgage documents amended without borrowers' signatures, one of which, the Crawley Agreement, showed alterations made after the original signing in a different ink, a detail the examiner noted with the dry precision of a man who had seen fraud before and recognized its handwriting. The total excess charged across all accounts came to $4,812. Sloan's lawyer had negotiated the terms in advance of the report's release, which meant that by the time Aldridge posted his findings at the county clerk's office, the agreement was already in place. Full repayment to affected ranchers, structured over 18 months, and the surrender of the bank's operating charter in Black Ridge County. Edgar Sloan was gone from the county before the report was public. His office in the narrow storefront building on Main Street was locked, the gilt lettering on the window already seeming like something from another era. Clara read the examiner's report at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, all 14 pages of it, twice. Rowan sat across from her and drank coffee and waited. When she set it down, he looked at her face and tried to read it, which was still, after more than a year, not an entirely reliable skill. "It's done," she said. "Yeah," he said. "The repayment schedule means we'll receive—" She did the arithmetic in her head. "Somewhere around $240 over the next 18 months. That clears the remaining mortgage balance with about $60 to spare." He was quiet for a moment. "We're going to own this ranch free and clear." "By next summer," she said, roughly. He put his coffee cup down, picked it up again, set it down a second time in a way that suggested he was doing it for something to do with his hands. "Your father paid for this land twice," she said, more gently. "Once when he bought it, and once because Sloan made him. I'm sorry it took this long for it to matter." Rowan looked at the table. "He died thinking he'd failed," he said. "That's what I keep coming back to. He sold off cattle he'd spent 20 years building, and he thought it was his fault. That his judgment was bad." He was quiet. "It wasn't bad judgment. He just trusted the wrong man." Clara didn't say anything. There were things that comfort didn't fix and that didn't need the attempt. She understood that his grief about his father was his own to carry, and that what she could do was sit here, present, without filling the silence with noise. After a while, Rowan looked up. "The Fords invited us for dinner Sunday," he said. "June Crawley is organizing something at the Grange Hall in January. She wants you there." "I'll be there," Clara said. He nodded, then, almost as an afterthought, "You're different to people now, the way they talk to you." She raised an eyebrow. "Tom Pryor asked me last week if you'd look at his pasture rotation," Rowan said. "Tom Pryor, who stood in front of Haskell's store the day you got here and told 3 men you were going to drive this ranch into the ground." Clara thought about that for a moment. She knew she was supposed to feel something vindicating about it, and she did, in a small, tired way. But she found that she mostly felt the absence of the bitterness she might have expected. It had worn away somewhere over the past 14 months, not through forgiveness exactly, but through simple preoccupation. There had been too much work to sustain resentment alongside it. "Tell him I'll come by in March," she said. "The ground will be workable by then." Victor Hale was the last problem, and he resolved in the way that problems resolved when they lost their leverage. In January, 2 weeks after the Grange Hall gathering, at which Clara had been asked more questions than she could answer in a single evening, and had scheduled 3 separate follow-up conversations with neighboring ranchers about breeding programs and pasture management, Hollis appeared at the Red Bluff gate for the 3rd and final time. Clara went to the gate herself. Rowan came with her and stood a step behind, which was a positioning they'd worked out without discussion over the past months. Present. Clearly present, but not in front. Hollis looked different this time. Not subdued exactly, but recalibrated. The message he carried was shorter than the previous ones. Mr. Hale would like to apologize for any misunderstandings that may have occurred during the past year. Mr. Hale would also like to inquire whether Red Bluff Ranch would consider a breeding arrangement for the coming season. Mr. Hale had heard considerable discussion of the Shorthorn Cross bloodline and believed it might benefit his own operation. Clara listened to this with a still face. "Tell Mr. Hale that we appreciate the inquiry," she said. "Our breeding arrangements for this season are already committed. He's welcome to write to us in the fall regarding next year's availability." Hollis received this. "And the misunderstandings?" "Tell him we've all moved on," she said, which was not the same as forgiveness, and Hollis was experienced enough to understand the distinction. He nodded, turned his horse, and rode east. Rowan watched him go. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," she said. "He can't buy us out. He can't starve us out. He can't run us off. And now the county is paying enough attention that any further direct action costs him more than we're worth in trouble." She watched the rider diminish into the distance. Men like Hale don't change. They just look for softer targets. She turned back toward the house. "We're not a soft target anymore." They walked back across the yard together, and Clara thought about the word "we" and how it had changed in her usage over the past year. moving from a cautious operational term to something that felt gradually like actual weight, like something she put her shoulder against. Signal was sold in April of his second year to a rancher from Colorado who'd come specifically to see him, driving 2 days to get there after a letter from Patterson that described the bull in terms the man later told Clara were the most enthusiastic he'd ever read from Patterson, who was not an enthusiastic man. The price they negotiated was the highest Clara had gotten for any animal since coming to Red Bluff, and it was not a number she shared widely because some information was more useful when it was private. She cried a little after. In the barn, alone, before the evening feeding, in the specific way she cried, quietly, briefly, with her hand against the empty stall wall. Then she washed her face at the pump and went in for supper and said nothing about it. Rowan knew. He didn't say anything either, which was exactly right. The heifer, Voss took her in May, arriving himself from Nebraska rather than sending anyone, which was its own statement about how seriously he'd come to take the Red Bluff breeding program. He and Clara spent a full day going over the animal together, and then over dinner at the house he asked whether she'd considered formalizing the breeding operation, documentation standards, a registered name, the kind of provenance paperwork that would allow Red Bluff calves to be sold with a clear recorded lineage. "I've considered it," she said. "The market for documented shorthorn crosses on the northern range is going to grow," Voss said. "There are a lot of operations trying to improve cold hardiness and pasture efficiency at the same time. What you have here it's not common." "I know," she said. "Then formalize it," he said. "Put your name on it." She looked across the table at Rowan, who was listening with the expression that meant he was following and had an opinion and was deciding whether to offer it. She gave him a slight nod. "The Red Bluff line," he said. "That's what you'd register it as. Red Bluff Shorthorn Cross." Voss considered this. "Simple. Easy to remember, yes." He nodded. "Do it." Clara looked at her plate. Her name wasn't in the title. It was the ranch's name, which was Rowan's family's name, which was older than she was on this land. But the line was hers, in the way that things you build from the ground up are yours regardless of what they're called. She'd found 14 animals and understood what they were, and made every decision that had grown from that understanding, and what had resulted was worth putting a name on. "We'll do it," she said. By the following autumn, 2 full years after Clara had stepped off a wagon in front of Black Ridge's only church while strangers laughed from across the road, Red Bluff Ranch ran 43 head of cattle, all of them carrying the registered Red Bluff bloodline in varying degrees, on pasture that had been rebuilt from bare dirt into the kind of dense, managed grass that a range inspector who came through in September called the best-maintained private pasture in the county. He said it to Rowan, and Rowan said simply, "My wife manages the pasture," and didn't elaborate because elaboration wasn't necessary. 3 neighboring ranchers had come to Clara for advice that year, not asking politely and hoping to be tolerated, but coming with their records and their specific problems, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger between them, asking real questions and expecting real answers. She gave real answers. She also, over the course of 2 of those conversations, noticed the same small arithmetic irregularities she'd seen in the Mercer records 3 years earlier. One rancher whose feed bills didn't add up right, another whose water rights agreement contained language that disadvantaged him in ways he hadn't understood when he signed. She told them what she saw. She helped them find their own records and read them. She did not take over. She'd learned that people needed to understand their own situations, that being handed answers was different from being shown how to arrive at them, and that the second thing was more durable than the first. Cass, who was 21 now, had taken on the role of second hand in everything but title, his small notebook replaced by a larger ledger of his own, his questions more refined and more technical than they'd been at 18. She'd started teaching him cattle assessment in a deliberate way, testing him against her own observations, correcting him when he was wrong, and telling him specifically why. He made mistakes with the patience of someone who'd learned that mistakes in this kind of work were expensive but not fatal, and that Claire's corrections were investments rather than criticisms. Deke was 53, and his back gave him trouble in cold weather now, which he did not mention and which Clara tracked in the way he held himself on cold mornings. She'd adjusted his work assignments without discussion, giving him the tasks that kept him out of the wet and cold, presenting it as operational logic. He knew what she was doing. He didn't say anything about it. That particular kind of silence between them had become one of the things she valued most about the Red Bluff arrangement. On a late October morning in 1893, exactly 2 years and a few weeks from the day she'd first walked the south pasture with a lamp before dawn, Clara stood at the east fence line, watching the herd graze, and tried to see what a stranger would see. Not what she knew about each animal, not the 2 years of documented observation and calculated decisions that connected her to every animal in that pasture. What a stranger would see, coming over the ridge on a horse and looking down at this operation for the first time. They would see a healthy herd, well-conformed animals in good condition moving across pasture that showed the care of active management, a fence line that was solid and functional, a barn behind the house that had been expanded twice since she'd arrived, a ranch that looked like a ranch that intended to continue. Rowan came up beside her. He did that, materialized without announcement at the moment she was standing somewhere looking at something, which she'd concluded was simply how he moved through his own land, quietly, knowing where to be. "Patterson's letter came," he said. "What does he want?" 3 calves from the next round, at a price that should cover the full year's operating costs if we hit it. He stopped. He asked specifically for your written assessment of each animal at 6 weeks to accompany the purchase. She looked at the herd. "He wants the documentation." "He wants what you write about them," Rowan said. "Same thing, I guess." She thought about that. The ledger she'd bought with her own money in the first month, the small notebook she'd filled and replaced and filled again, the breeding records she'd built from nothing using her uncle's 22 years of lessons and her own 3 years of direct observation. The documentation was what separated what Red Bluff did from what everyone else did, and Patterson understood that, and Voss understood it, and the 3 younger ranchers who'd come to the kitchen table this year were beginning to understand it. "Tell him yes," she said. Rowan nodded. He stood beside her at the fence, both of them looking at the cattle, and there was something in the quality of that standing, the way they occupied the same space at the same fence, looking at the same animals, that meant something different than it would have meant 2 years ago. In October of 1891, they had been 2 strangers performing a practical arrangement, and the tenderness between them had been as thin and provisional as early ice on a shallow creek. What it had become was harder to name because it had been built so gradually. From shared mornings and shared work, from the specific intimacy of 2 people surviving difficult things in close proximity, from the incremental trust that comes not from declarations but from simply being reliable, day after day, through a Wyoming winter and then another one. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the fence rail, not asking anything, just placing it there. She didn't pull away. "The Ford's new bull will be ready to assess in spring," she said after a moment. He said. "I want to go up to the Johnson property in March to look at their pasture drainage situation. I think I can help them fix it without much cost." "I'll drive you," he said. "You don't need to." "Clara," he said, "I want to drive you." She was quiet for a moment. The cattle moved in the pale morning light, slow and purposeful in the way of animals that had enough to eat and enough space to move through. Signal's son, a bull calf born in February of this year, deep red, already showing the same solid frame, was moving at the edge of the group, learning the hierarchy of the herd in the unhurried way of young animals, who haven't yet learned to be in a hurry. She looked at all of it and tried to remember what it had looked like the first time. The dying grass, the broken fence, the inadequate water, the thin and ordinary cattle that had been covering up, without knowing it, something worth saving. She had seen it then. She had staked everything she had on what she saw, and the scene had been right, but the scene was only the beginning of what it had taken. She'd learned that about value, not just in cattle, not just in land, but in the general sense. The things that were actually worth something rarely announced themselves. They sat in the middle of ordinary-looking circumstances and waited for someone to look closely enough, patiently enough, to understand what was actually there. Most people never looked that long. They saw what was easy to see, made their judgments, moved on. The people who looked longer, who were willing to sit with uncertainty, to study what others had written off, to trust their own reading even when everyone around them said they were wrong. Those people found things that no one else had thought to find. Clara was not a romantic about this. She knew that hard work and careful thinking didn't guarantee anything, that the storm in November could have gone differently, that Signal's first buyer could have been Hale himself with a better legal argument, that Sloane's fraud might have gone undiscovered if Aldridge hadn't been a thorough man who cared about small numbers. Luck was real. Circumstance was real. The margin between the version of this story where Red Bluff survived and the version where it didn't was, in places, genuinely thin. But she also knew that she had built what she'd built from something no one had given her. The capacity to look at something that everyone else had dismissed and see it clearly. The willingness to act on that seeing without needing other people to confirm it first. The patience to work toward a result that wouldn't come quickly, through winters and setbacks, and the particular exhaustion of being underestimated by everyone around you. That was not nothing. In fact, it was the only thing. She turned her hand over on the fence rail and laced her fingers through Rowan's, which surprised him enough that she felt it, a slight tension, then a slow release, as he adjusted to something he'd wanted long enough that its arrival took a moment to register. "Johnson's pasture drainage," he said, after a few seconds. "March," she confirmed. "I'll drive you," he said again. "I know," she said. The morning went on around them. Deke's voice from the direction of the barn, organizing Cass about something with his usual economy of words. The sound of the recovered creek running properly in its channel behind the north pasture. The cattle moving through grass that had been rebuilt from nothing over 2 careful years. Black Ridge had never apologized for what it said and thought on the October morning when Clara Ashford stepped off a wagon and a town full of people decided, in the space of 30 seconds, what she was worth. Towns like that rarely did. The woman who'd arrived here had not come expecting apologies, had not organized her effort around the hope of them, had not waited for the permission of other people's good opinion before deciding to try. She had just worked. She had just looked and thought and planned and worked. Through cold and doubt and deliberate sabotage and the grinding, slow patience that real change required. And the ranch that everyone said she would ruin was, instead, the place that other people were beginning to look to. That was not justice, exactly. Justice would have required someone to admit they'd been wrong, and people rarely did that cleanly. But it was something more durable than justice. It was the record, in the ledger, in the land, in the condition of healthy animals on recovered pasture, in the younger ranchers who came to the kitchen table with their problems and left with better questions. The record spoke. That was enough. She looked across the herd one more time, making the quiet daily count that she'd made every morning for 2 years, confirming that everything was present and accounted for, that nothing had been lost, that the work had held through another night. Then she went back to the house, sat at the kitchen table with her ledger, and started the next page.